So by the time I started this project, perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, there weren't really any complete Churchills left that hadn't already been put in museums or restored. There were absolutely none of these particular types of Churchills left anywhere that I could find, except ones that had been on ranges or left abandoned at the back of army bases after being used for some project or other that frankly none of us will ever know about. This hull had lain unused, untouched for, we think, decades, and it was, however, closed up. The hatches were closed, the engine decks were closed, and so there was a great moment when we opened those hatches to see the inside for the first time in all those ages that it had spent sitting outside in the rain, being battered by the elements. And inside, the engine was still there, the gearbox was still there, and at that stage we were able to pull the dipstick out and see fresh oil still on it. It was just an incredible time capsule. But of course what we also discovered was that the moisture that had got in had been trapped, rust had set in lots of places, both around the metalwork of the hull, which is mild steel on the inside, but also in some of the ancillaries and the engine itself. So then everything had to come out, it had to be shot blasted back to clean metal, primed and repainted. And the result at that stage was a nice clean silver tank inside, until one of the veterans from the 9th Royal Tank Regiment said to me that our tanks were never silver, that was post-war. It's got to be white. So all of that work then had to be redone and the inside made white again, which they're absolutely convinced was the correct colour during the war for these tanks. The interesting thing about the Churchill is that unlike many of the tanks around us, it was designed to work with the infantry. It was a tank that went hand in glove with infantry operations. In fact, it could only do initially about 15 miles an hour, and by the time they'd finished, probably 12 or 13 miles an hour. And the reduction was caused by the increased armour they had to put on to protect against ever more effective German guns. The way the tank operated was to be with the infantry, and as the infantry were up against an obstacle that they couldn't defeat, a blockhouse, a bunker, a strong point, the tank would come in and using its heavier weapons and its armour protection, it would deal with the things that the infantry couldn't.
Churchill was the first tank to enter production with what was known as the Merritt-Brown steering system. Now we could talk for hours about tank steering, but we're not going to. The point about the Merritt system is that it had a regenerative arrangement built in, and this means that instead of having to stop one track solid and jam the brakes on, thus wasting a heck of a lot of power, the gearbox inside the engine can actually push the drive to whichever track you want to use to turn the tank round. It's very clever stuff. Instructors for years afterwards used to torture young soldiers by telling them that Henry Merritt, the man who invented the gearbox, went mad because he never worked out how he'd done it in the first place. But that, as usual, is a jolly nice military myth. Now there are those who say that the British Army's tanks run on oil leaks even today, but there is a limit, and what was happening was that a driver taking his Churchill tank out on the ranges would pull back right stick, we'll say, in order to swing the tank around. As he did so, the oil, mixing with the dust from the brake shoes, formed a sort of claggy mess, and when he tried to release the brake, it stayed on. The tank continued to swing to the right as he was trying to get it to go straight. His first panic reaction, grab the left-hand lever, pull that back, get the tank on a straight course. This action of pulling back the left-hand lever only compounds the problem because more oil, more dust get into the gearbox, and in the end, with all the gears straining, the brakes binding, the gearbox blows up. The incidence of these faults is absolutely staggering. At one point, the War Office are told that something like 42% of production Churchills are off the road, mainly with gearbox failures. And just to give you an idea of how rampant this got, there are very early editions of the Churchill Handbook, and these are books issued to the crews of tanks. They're not for the generals to read, these are the guys who are actually there doing the business. And you open up this book and inside there's a little yellow leaflet, if you like, tucked into the front cover, and it's from Vauxhall Motors. It's addressing the crew of the tank and it is saying, look lads, frightfully sorry, We know this thing isn't quite right, we're working on it, bear with us. As a piece of publicity, it is absolutely amazing. No company would do that with a new car. But here, a little bit of honesty paid off. It gave the crews just that little bit more faith to keep trying.